She was small, not human, yet she chose a human to be her husband HFY. The Hall of the Galactic Concord was built for beings much larger than humans. The ceiling curved like the inside of a hollow planet, filled with soft moving lights that adjusted to hundreds of different eyes. Rows of floating platforms held delegates from species that ruled stars, consumed suns, or lived for thousands of years. Voices echoed in strange tones, clicks and vibrations. Captain Elias Morgan stood on a simple metal platform near the back. He wore a plain dark uniform with a small human emblem on his chest. No weapons, no guards. Humanity had been invited as observers only. New species did not speak much in the Concord. They listened. They learned. They tried not to offend anyone important. Elias kept his hands behind his back and his face calm. Inside, he felt very small. Humans had reached faster than light travel only 30 years ago. They were strong compared to some species, weak compared to many others. Their worlds were rich but not ancient. Their fleets were growing but still few. The Concord had allowed them entry mostly out of curiosity. The session was almost over when something unexpected happened. A soft chime sounded, not loud, not demanding, but the entire hall slowly fell silent. Even the loudest predators stopped moving. Elias followed the direction of the sound. On a platform near the center floated a figure so small that many had ignored her before. She was barely half a meter tall. Her body was slender, almost delicate, covered in pale blue skin that shimmered faintly. Her eyes were large and dark, reflecting the lights above. She wore a simple silver mantle that marked her as Velari. The Velari were known in the Concord but rarely noticed. A low-gravity species, fragile bodies, small population, they survived by negotiation, not force. Many larger empires saw them as dependents, useful advisors at best, easy territory at worst. The small Velari woman raised one thin hand. "I invoke the right of choosing," she said. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried without effort. The translator hummed softly in Elias' ear. A ripple moved through the hall. Some delegates shifted. Others leaned forward. A few made sounds of disbelief. The right of choosing was ancient, older than most empires. Rarely used, the presiding entity, a massive being of crystal and light, turned its attention toward her. "State your name and intent." "My name is Lurie of the Third Bloom," she said. "I choose a life bond protector." That caused open reaction. Several delegates spoke at once before silencing themselves. Life bond protector was not a military title. It was deeper than alliance. It was a binding of fate, recognized by conquered law. To choose one meant tying the future of a species to another. The crystal entity paused. "You are Velari. Your species is under conquered protection already." "Yes," Lurie replied. "Protection without partnership." The entity considered this. "And whom do you choose?" Lurie turned. Her large eyes focused on Elias Morgan. For a moment, Elias was sure the translator had failed. He felt every eye in the hall swing toward him. Heat rose in his face. His heart began to pound. "I choose the human," Lurie said. "Captain Elias Morgan, representative of Earth." Silence crashed down heavier than noise. Then came laughter, not all at once but in waves, deep rumbling amusement from large predators, sharp clicking mockery from insectoid minds. Even a few human aides gasped in shock. A being of scaled iron leaned forward. "The Velari choose a child species." Another voice followed. "Humans cannot even protect themselves from their own wars." Elias felt his throat tighten. He had trained for hostility, for threat, for violence, not for this. The presiding entity raised a limb of light. "Silence!" The hall obeyed. "Human," the entity said, turning to Elias. "Do you understand what is being offered?" Elias swallowed. His training screamed caution. His instincts screamed uncertainty. But he remembered why he had joined the fleet in the first place. Humans survived by stepping forward when it mattered. "Yes," he said. His voice sounded steady even to himself. "I understand. And do you accept?" He looked at Lurie. She was small, fragile-looking, surrounded by giants who saw her as weak, but her gaze did not waver. There was no fear in her eyes, only certainty. "I accept," Elias said. The laughter stopped. That alone was worth recording in Concord history. The presiding entity announced that the bond would require validation. Until then, Elias and Lurie were granted provisional status and escorted to neutral quarters. As they left the hall, Elias became very aware of how exposed he felt. Conversations followed them like shadows. He heard fragments. "Humans overreach again. She chose them on purpose. This will end badly." The doors closed behind them, sealing out the noise. The corridor beyond was quiet, lined with smooth walls that shifted color gently. A small hover platform drifted toward them and stopped. Lurie stepped onto it with practiced ease. Elias hesitated, then followed. The platform adjusted its gravity instantly. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then Lurie broke the silence. "You did not hesitate," she said. Elias let out a slow breath. "I had about 3 seconds of panic." She tilted her head slightly. "That is acceptable." He almost smiled. They traveled deeper into the station, away from public halls. Finally, the platform stopped before a private chamber. The door sealed behind them. The room was simple. Neutral gravity, seating adjusted to both sizes. Elias sat carefully. Lurie remained standing on the platform, bringing her closer to eye level. "Why?" he asked. It came out more blunt than he intended. Lurie studied him. "You want honesty?" "Yes." "My people have watched yours," she said. "From a distance." Elias frowned. "We didn't know." "You were not meant to," she replied. "You fight yourselves, you argue endlessly, you are loud and emotional. That doesn't sound like a recommendation." "It is," she said calmly. "Because when you choose to protect, you do so even when there is no gain." She tapped a small device at her wrist. A projection appeared between them. Images of human ships pulling alien refugees from burning stations. Human medics treating enemies and allies alike. Human soldiers standing between civilians and attackers, dying without orders to do so. "You are reckless with your lives," Lurie said softly, "but not with others." Elias felt something heavy settle in his chest. "Other species protect what they own," she continued. "You protect what you believe is right." He shook his head slightly. "We also fail, a lot." "Yes," she agreed. "So do we, that is why we survive." She stepped closer, her voice lowering. "The conquered sees my people as small and harmless. They forget that survival is not only about strength, it is about choosing allies wisely." "You're using us," Elias said. Lurie did not deny it. "Yes, and trusting you. That's a risk." Her eyes softened. "So is choosing nothing." A signal chimed softly in the room. The validation trials would begin soon. Outside the chamber, powerful beings were already debating how to challenge the bond. Some planned to humiliate the humans. Others planned to test them until they broke. Lurie looked up at Elias. "They will try to prove you are unworthy." Elias stood straighter. "Then we'll prove them wrong." For the first time, Lurie smiled. It was small, quiet, and full of hope. The announcement of the validation trials spread through the Concord faster than any signal. By the time Elias and Lurie were escorted back into public space, the station felt different. Eyes followed them everywhere. Some curious, some hostile, some calculating. The trials would decide whether the life bond was real or rejected. If rejected, the Velari would lose the right to choose again for generations. If accepted, humanity would no longer be observers. They would be bound to the fate of another species. Elias understood the weight of it as they entered the trial chamber. It was not an arena. There were no weapons, no obstacles, no obvious dangers. Instead, the chamber changed shape slowly, adjusting gravity, light, and sound. Platforms rose and lowered, forming a space that could become almost anything. The presiding entity floated above the center. "The conquered does not test strength alone," it announced. Strength is common. We test judgment, restraint, and resolve. Elias stood still. Lurie rested on her hover platform beside him. The first test began without warning. The floor shifted. Gravity increased suddenly, pressing down on Elias' body. His knees bent, muscles straining. He adjusted his stance and stayed upright. Across the chamber, a projection appeared. A Velari settlement, delicate structures built for low gravity, was shown under threat. A simulated force of attackers approached. Not lethal, not real, but convincing. A voice echoed, "You may intervene." Elias turned to the presiding entity. "With what?" The answer came calmly. "With authority." He looked back at the image. If he ordered a human fleet to intervene, it would show aggression. If he did nothing, it would show weakness. Lurie watched him carefully. Elias took a breath. "We request evacuation support only," he said. "No weapons, no threats." Some delegates reacted with surprise. Others scoffed. The simulation changed. Human ships appeared, focusing on moving civilians away rather than confronting the attackers. The threat lost its leverage without resistance to provoke. The image faded. The gravity returned to normal. Murmurs filled the chamber. "That was mercy," one delegate said. "That was hesitation," another replied. The presiding entity recorded the result. The second test came harder. A corridor formed, narrow and dim. Elias and Lurie were separated by a transparent barrier. On Elias' side, alarms sounded. Simulated fire, structural collapse warnings. On Lurie's side, silence. A voice spoke directly to Elias. "You may save one side, choose." Elias stepped forward instantly. "Open the barrier. Only one side can be accessed." He clenched his jaw. He understood the test. Save himself or save her. Save the bond or abandon it. Lurie met his eyes through the barrier. She did not speak. She did not plead. Elias turned away from his own side and slammed his hand against the control panel leading to her chamber. "I choose her," he said. "No delay." The barrier dropped. At the same moment, the fire alarms on his side intensified. Heat washed over him. Pain flared across his arm as simulated debris struck. He did not stop moving. He reached Lurie, lifted her platform controls, and guided her through the collapsing corridor. His movements were rough, urgent, unpolished. He shielded her with his own body without thinking. The simulation ended abruptly. Elias collapsed to one knee, breathing hard. His arm ached, nerves screaming even though no real injury existed. Lurie stared at him, eyes wide. The chamber was silent. The presiding entity spoke. "You chose loss without calculation." Elias pushed himself up. "I chose responsibility." The entity did not respond immediately. The third test was the hardest. A council of delegates formed a half-circle around Elias and Lurie. Each represented a different power. Each asked questions designed to break alliances. "You will be commanded," one said. "Will you obey us or her?" "I will listen," Elias replied. "Then decide." "Humans are violent," another said. "What happens when your instincts override reason?" Elias did not deny it. "Then we take responsibility for the damage and try to do better." "Velari are weak," a third said, looking directly at Lurie. "They will slow you down." Elias stepped slightly forward, not blocking her but standing with her. "They will guide us," Lurie finally spoke. "Humans are not our shield," she said softly. "They are our voice when we are ignored." The chamber reacted to that. The tests continued for hours. Scenarios of famine, rebellion, moral conflict. Elias never claimed perfection. He never promised victory. He promised effort, protection, and honesty. Some delegates were unsettled by that. Others were quietly impressed. At the end, the presiding entity called for recess. Elias and Lurie were returned to their chamber. Elias sat heavily on the seat, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. "They're trying to break us," he said. "Yes," Lurie replied. "They break what they fear." He glanced at her. "And what do they fear?" She considered the question. "That you will not become like them." Outside, unseen by Elias, messages were already moving. Some empires began planning countermeasures. Others began reassessing humanity's place in the galaxy. The trials were not over. They had only just begun to matter. The next cycle began with no warning. Elias woke to a low vibration through the floor. Not an alarm, not a drill tone. Something deeper, almost like the station itself, was uneasy. He sat up immediately, training taking over. The room lights shifted to alert white. Across the chamber, Lurie was already awake, standing on her hover platform. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were focused. "The Conquered has received an emergency signal," she said, "from Velari space." Elias was on his feet in seconds. "Real?" "Yes." That single word changed everything. The chamber door opened without ceremony. A Conquered attendant, tall and narrow with metallic skin, gestured urgently. "You are required in the strategic hall, now." As they moved through the station, Elias noticed something important. The whispers were gone, the stares were sharper. This was no longer curiosity. This was concern. The strategic hall was smaller than the main chamber but filled with motion. Holograms hovered in the air, showing star maps and shifting symbols. At the center was a glowing red marker. The Velari home system. A hostile fleet had entered without warning. Not a massive armada, but enough to overwhelm Velari defenses. The attackers believed the Conquered would react slowly. They believed the Velari were alone. They were wrong. "The trials are suspended," the presiding entity announced. "This is now a live evaluation." Elias clenched his fists. "Evaluation of what?" "Of whether your bond holds under threat." The words were cold but honest. The attackers were not breaking Conquered law openly. They claimed a resource dispute, a legal excuse. If the Velari resisted alone and failed, the Conquered would respond too late. Lurie floated forward. "They expect us to call for protection," she said. "They expect delay." Elias looked at the map. "What do they not expect?" She met his eyes. Coordination. Within minutes, Elias was connected to human command. Earth's response was immediate, not loud, not dramatic. Human fleets were closer than anyone expected, not because they were invading, because they were exploring. Small task groups shifted course. Supply ships rerouted. Civilian transports were cleared from the path. No speeches, no hesitation. The Conquered watched silently. Human ships did not rush in weapons first. They arrived in formation, spreading out, placing themselves between the attackers and Velari space lanes. They broadcast evacuation corridors. They shared targeting data with Velari stations. The attackers hesitated. That was the mistake. Velari defenses activated, not powerful but precise. Mines placed exactly where ships would maneuver. Sensor ghosts created false targets. Human pilots followed Velari guidance without question. Elias stood beside Lurie in the command chamber, watching the battle unfold through shared feeds. He gave orders, but most decisions came from Velari tacticians. He did not override them. He trusted them. An enemy cruiser broke through the outer line, heading straight for a Velari habitat ring. Elias felt his pulse spike. "Human frigates intercept," he ordered. They moved instantly, not to destroy, to block. The frigates took hits meant for the habitat ring. Shields flared. Hulls scorched. One ship lost propulsion and drifted, still transmitting evacuation support until power failed. Lurie's hands tightened on her platform controls. "They will remember that," she said softly. The battle did not last long. Once the attackers realized the Velari were not isolated, once they saw human ships absorbing risk without demanding control, their confidence cracked. They withdrew, claiming miscalculation. The Conquered recorded everything. Silence followed the final retreat. In the strategic hall, reactions came slowly. "They acted without conquest," one delegate said. "They followed Velari command," another added, sounding almost confused. "They accepted losses for a species not their own." The presiding entity turned toward Elias and Lurie. "The bond has altered the balance," it said. Yes, Lurie replied. That was the point. Afterward, Elias was escorted to a medical bay. Minor burns, stress fatigue, nothing serious. Lurie waited nearby. When the medics left, Elias leaned back, staring at the ceiling. That wasn't a test, he said. No, she agreed. That was truth. He turned his head to look at her. You knew this could happen. Yes. And you still chose us. Lurie moved closer. Because when humans commit, they do not ask if the cost is fair. Outside the medical bay, conquered delegates argued quietly. Some demanded sanctions against the attackers. Others questioned why humans had been allowed to intervene so freely. But something had shifted. The trials resumed the next cycle, but their tone was different. No longer searching for weakness, now searching for limits. The final evaluation came in the form of a choice. The conquered offered humanity a proposal, recognition as a protector species with influence and authority. In exchange, the life bond would be reclassified. The Velari would become a client state under human oversight. It was framed as efficiency. Elias listened in silence as the terms were explained. Then he looked at Lurie. She said nothing. Her face was unreadable. Elias stood. Humanity declines, he said. The chamber froze. The presiding entity's light flickered. You refuse elevation. We refuse ownership, Elias replied. The bond is partnership, not control. Murmurs spread instantly. You weaken your position, a delegate warned. Elias nodded. Then we'll live with that. Lurie finally spoke. This is why we chose them. The presiding entity was silent for a long moment. Then it spoke words no one expected. The life bond stands. The declaration echoed through the chamber. Elias exhaled slowly, realizing only then how much tension he had been holding. The galaxy had not fully accepted them, but it could no longer ignore them. And that, Elias knew, was only the beginning. The conquered did not celebrate decisions. It recorded them. Still, the moment the life bond was confirmed, the station felt different. Not louder, not brighter, but steadier, as if a long argument had finally reached an answer. Elias stood beside Lurie in the central hall once more. This time, they were not placed at the edge. Their platform floated closer to the center, not as a reward but as recognition. The presiding entity spoke to the assembly. The validation is complete. The bond between humanity and the Velari is accepted under conquered law. No applause followed. That was not how the conquered worked. Instead, something more important happened. No one laughed. Several delegates withdrew quietly. Others stayed, studying Elias and Lurie with new caution. A few watched with something close to respect. The session ended shortly after. As the hall emptied, Lurie remained still, looking out over the space where decisions had shaped civilizations. You changed nothing and everything, she said. Elias exhaled. I didn't plan to. That is why it worked. They were escorted back to their quarters, but this time the path was clear. No whispers, no mocking glances, just careful distance. In the days that followed, consequences began to unfold. The attackers who had tested Velari space were summoned before the conquered. Evidence was presented, not accusations, just facts, timelines, recordings, outcomes. Sanctions followed, not harsh but lasting. Other small species took notice. Requests for dialogue increased, not alliances, not protection, conversation. Human diplomats found themselves busy in ways they had never expected. Not demanding seats of power, but being asked how they had learned to stand beside others without standing over them. Elias stayed mostly out of politics. His role was complete, or so he thought. One quiet cycle, Lurie invited him to the observation ring. It overlooked open space, stars drifting slowly past like distant thoughts. My people will return home soon, she said. Elias nodded. I figured. The bond does not require proximity, she continued. Only commitment. He looked at her. Are you asking me something? She turned to face him fully. Yes. She raised a small data crystal. Velari tradition allows one shared residence between bonded partners, neutral ground. a place neither species controls. Elias took the crystal carefully. You want to live together. In time, she said, not as rulers, not as symbols, as partners. Elias thought of Earth, of its noise, its chaos, its beauty. He thought of Velari worlds, fragile and precise, shaped by careful thought. I think, he said slowly, we'd annoy each other. Lurie's lips curved slightly. Frequently, he smiled. Then yes. The decision was recorded quietly. When the human fleet departed the conquered station, it did so without ceremony. No banners, no declarations. Just ships returning to their duties, but the galaxy was watching. Stories spread, changed with retelling but always circling the same truth. Humans had refused power, they had accepted risk. They had chosen partnership over control. Months passed. On the Velari homeworld, reconstruction continued. Not hurried, not desperate, careful. Human engineers worked beside Velari planners, following instructions rather than giving them. It surprised many. On Earth, debates raged. Some praised the bond, others feared it. Humanity had never agreed on anything for long, but one thing was clear. They were no longer alone. Elias stood on a shared habitat looking out over a Velari sky. The light was softer here, filtered through thin atmosphere. Lurie stood beside him, her hover platform resting low. You know, he said, some still think you chose us because we're dangerous. She looked up at him. Are you? He considered it. Sometimes. That is not why, she said. Then why? Because when the galaxy measures worth in size and strength, humans measure it in action. He said nothing, letting the moment settle. A message arrived from the conquered. New policies were being drafted. Species classification would no longer be based solely on physical capability. Contribution, reliability, and shared risk would matter. It would take time. Change always did. Lurie watched the horizon. The galaxy will test this, she said. Elias nodded. So will we. They stood there together, not as legends, not as rulers, but as proof. Proof that strength did not need to be loud. Proof that even the smallest voice could choose its future. And proof that when a non-human woman, small in body but vast in vision, chose a human to stand beside her, the galaxy listened. Not because it had to, but because it finally understood that humanity's greatest power was not what it could take. It was what it chose to protect.